Rewind, your week in review, is sponsored by the Wisconsin Realtors Association, bringing Wisconsin communities to life with great homes, businesses, and neighborhoods. The Wisconsin Realtors Association, the voice of real estate.
This week on Rewind, your week in review. Governor Tony Evers announces 25% occupancy limits in rooms and businesses. Republican legislative leaders say that order is illegal and ask the governor to draft a rule they could kill. On Thursday, Federal Court of Appeals judges overruled a lower court and ordered that all Wisconsin absentee ballots must be returned by 8 p.m. on Election Day, November 3. Joe Biden keeps a 5 percentage point lead over President Trump in the Marquette University poll. Rewind, your week in review for October 9. I'm Steve Walters.
And I'm J.R. Ross.
The very busy week, so we got no time to dawdle. We have to talk about on Tuesday. The governor ordered a 25% occupancy limit on rooms, buildings, and stores. Why? Because on Thursday he announced a record 3,132 positives. We have almost tripled the number of hospitalizations with COVID. We'll be talking about that more later. His emergency order, his extension, it runs through, this is very interesting, 2 incubation periods, of COVID-19 ending on November 6th. It includes a potential punishment, his chief lawyer said, of a civil forfeiture of $500. I want to, before I get to JR, just run through the exemptions. Schools and colleges, child care centers, religious organizations, offices and manufacturers that allow only employees, grocers and food distribution centers, healthcare facilities, nursing homes, local governments. Okay, JR, before we hear from the governor and his chief lawyer, your thoughts on why now, why Tuesday, and any other relevant observations?
Hey, look at any map of the COVID-19 cases in this country, and Wisconsin is a problem area. Last week we were number 3 in the country for the raw number of cases, and also number 3 for the number of cases per 100,000 residents. There's a problem. Now the question is obviously why? Why are we having these issues? And there are a lot of theories. I've heard things like there's fatigue in Wisconsin about the various orders about social distancing and masks. There are problems with college campuses, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom line is we've got a problem. How do we stop it? Because our hospital systems now are reporting they are at or near capacity and are starting to be overwhelmed. There's all these things going on. This is the governor's answer. The interesting thing has been that with the mask mandate, looking at the polls, especially this week's Marquette poll, is very popular. Very popular. The question is, with an order like this, is there a breaking point for Wisconsinites where they go, okay, I've liked the governor's done so far, but this one's just too much. We went through the stay-at-home order back in March. It's October now. Why are we doing this now? And so it remains to be seen how people react to it. Don't forget, locals can enforce a more restrictive order, but also it's up to them to enforce it, period. And we saw with the mask mandates that more than half, if not 2/3 of the sheriffs in Wisconsin said, we're not going to enforce that. Right. So it remains to be seen if this is going to be a silver bullet to change the trajectory that we're on with COVID cases.
And just to PS, Wisconsin Public Radio reported that both Madison and Milwaukee will have their own standards. Madison leaders say ours are more stricter than the 25%. But anyway, before we talk about the reaction and Monday's important meeting in the Capitol, virtually by Zoom, let's listen to the governor defending his new 25% occupancy limit and his chief lawyer talking about how, if it's challenged in court, he expects it to survive. Please.
At the end of the day, this is not about Wills versus Evers or Republicans versus Democrats or whatever. It is about individual responsibility. We're providing leadership with this order to make sure that we are in a place that we're going to make a difference. To me, it's always been less about who sues who and what is the outcome. We spend a lot of time talking about it, but it doesn't keep a single person alive, doesn't keep a single person from getting it.
I have no doubt that we'll probably see litigation on this order as well. That said, this is a very targeted order. It's using authority from DHS authority that the Supreme Court did not touch in the Safer at Home decision. In fact, they exempted the one part of the Safer at Home order that was not overruled by the Supreme Court, relied on the exact same provision, and it allows DHS to limit and regulate public gatherings at schools, churches, and other places, and that's exactly what this order does.
Before we get to the response of Senator Noss and Assembly Speaker Voss, I just want to add a footnote that comes from the executive order from issued by DHS Secretary Palm. That says, assuming deaths increase at the same rate, COVID deaths, as they did between September 4 and October 4, COVID-19 would rank as the sixth leading cause of death in Wisconsin this year, behind only heart disease, cancer, unintentional injuries, lower respiratory disease, and stroke. Just a footnote, we now are at 1,424 deaths. And the executive order says this: in the whole flu season of last year, 2019 to 20, there were 183 flu-related deaths. Now let's talk about the reaction of Senator Noss. The Secretary Palm falsely stated her order was compliant with the state Supreme Court ruling that JR alluded to earlier. The order is not enforceable in its current form. And he says, I will present a motion for a vote in the Joint Committee for Review of Administrative Rules meeting at 1 o'clock on Monday that would legally require DHS to comply with state law. And the response of Speaker Voss, we are confident that if challenged, a Wisconsin judge would find this order invalid as a unpromulgated rule. We are asking Palm to submit an emergency rule immediately to JCRAR as required by law. With cases once again rising, it's clear that the governor's go-it-alone, grab-bag approach to responding to the coronavirus has been a failure. Okay, JR, what could happen Monday, 1 p.m. at JCRAR? They don't have a rule before them. Are they just going to ask for one, demand for one? What are your thoughts?
What Noss's office told us is that they're going to vote, or they're pushing for a vote to compel the administration to submit this as a rule. Now, a couple things I don't know. Is there a time limit on doing that? I mean, in theory, the administration say, okay, that's nice you voted that way, but we're going to take our time and we might wait weeks, months. You know, I don't know what the restrictions are, what the powers are of that committee. Number two, let's pull back a little bit. Remember that Republicans have the power to overturn the public health emergency and the mask mandate that is separate from this. They have not convened to do so. Going through JCRAR appears to be a way of, one, getting at this order, which is coming from the DHS secretary. It is not from the governor. It's under powers the DHS secretary has. And the governor's chief legal counsel says these powers were untouched by the state Supreme Court decision. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to tell you if that's true or not. But they're arguing these powers are preserved. Therefore, the order is valid. Republicans can't overturn it by a joint resolution. It's different. This is trying to get at that sort of a lawsuit, because think about it. The lawsuit back in the spring, which affected Palm's powers, was a 4-3 ruling in which conservative Justice Brian Hagedorn joined two liberals at the time in the minority. Since that decision, conservative Justice Daniel Kelly has been replaced by liberal Joe Karofsky. Now, we don't predict how judges were going to vote, but you can kind of see Joe Karofsky lining up with the other two liberals in the court. There is a theory that if you take this back to the court system and works its way back to the state Supreme Court, you could get a different ruling that would, in fact, embrace the powers that Palm once claimed but were overturned by the Supreme Court. Now, that's a ways down the road. Yeah. But the governor has put Republicans in the defensive position with a lot of this stuff. They're on the losing in the mask mandate debate so far. They're trying to figure out a way to maneuver this one and try the upper hand in a debate about what's the best thing to do with COVID. And oh, by the way, it's all happening when the legislature has not met since mid-April on a single bill about COVID, and we have cases exploding in Wisconsin.
Yeah, we had a statement from the governor's deputy press secretary. It's been 175 days since the legislature passed the bill. We got so much news this week, we got to move on. On Wednesday, then, at the second DHS briefing, the governor announced that a alternate care facility will be opening Wednesday at State Fair Park. And that's because at the time on Wednesday, we had 853 hospitalized. The chief medical officer of the Wisconsin Hospital Association just said that number is up to 907. So it's tripled almost in a month. This will be a facility for patients who still need care, including oxygen, but not hospital level care. They have been hospitalized. So this is a transition facility. It'll have 530 beds, and it will not accept walk-in patients. Officials say the facility could be open for 50 patients on Wednesday, and this is being covered by the $465 million. That's an important number that the governor set aside in federal COVID. Now, Deb Stanrich, on that news conference, who is the CEO of the new alternate care facility that will open, talked about exactly how it'll work, who will get care there. So let's listen to her, please.
I think the easiest way to understand the alternate care facility is exactly what it says. It's an alternative to a hospital setting. So a patient would be transferred from potentially a Fox Valley hospital down to the alternate care facility. They would be between the ages of 18 and 70 years old. They have been in the hospital for 24 to 48 hours. This is a hospital transferred to the alternate care facility. It is not a physician clinic. It is not a physician office. Patients there would be relatively healthy, be able to ambulate on their own or have the assistance of one person, and they would need more oxygen therapy. We have, as you mentioned, Secretary Palm, inline oxygen provided. They may need additional IV medications or other types of medications to ensure they are healthy enough to be discharged home. There is a multidisciplinary team of physicians, allied health, nurses, patient care assistants, respiratory therapists, social workers that are part of the multidisciplinary team that designs a care plan for the patients that are there and will discharge the patients back home or to a facility that they were transferred from.
Another major news development this week, Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals said Wisconsin must go back to counting absentee ballots received by 8 p.m. on November 3rd, Election Day. JR, you've done a lot more work on this issue than I have. Can you put some context on this, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So this fight's been back and forth between the federal courts and the state courts. So when it went back to the federal court with a ruling that Republicans, in the opinion of the state Supreme Court, have standing to challenge that decision, the appeals court said a couple of things. One, in a 2-1 ruling, which is important, the majority said this was issued too close to the election. There's a principle under U.S. Supreme Court precedent saying they do not like the courts to change the rules of state elections close to people going to the polls. 2, that people have had months to prepare for this. It's unlike April, where these orders came in the middle of a burgeoning pandemic. We've had plenty of time to prepare for this. And oh, by the way, the judge focused on those who wait till the last minute. Those who wait till the last minute have problems all of their own, even in a normal situation. Now, the dissenting judge said this was a travesty, using her words, that there will be thousands of Wisconsinites trying to exercise the right to vote, who will now be denied that right. And she actually, at the end of her decision, said, God bless. Good luck and God bless Wisconsin. Now, my questions are, will there be an appeal? If the groups who sued for the changes had won at the appeals court level, I am fairly confident, people I talked to, that Republican lawmakers would have challenged this to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now that the appeals court has ruled against those groups, will they try to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which has been hesitant to make changes so close to an election? That's a big question I'm watching in the coming days, whether this case is over or if we got one more step before it's done.
Okay, and let's go back to some important other numbers. JR, are we still at 1.2 million voters have asked for absentee ballots, or what's the latest number? Is it still about one?
Clips 1.3 million. We're up around 647,000 returned as of this morning. One thing to keep in mind, 1/3 of those votes returned are from Milwaukee and Dane counties. Wow. It underscores that Democrats are more likely to use the absentee balloting process than Republicans are right now. Backs up the polling we saw in the Marquette survey this week. But it's just an explosion. I mean, it's well above what we saw 4 years ago. It blew that away a while ago.
Right. Megan Wolf, the Elections Commission administrator, who we're about to hear from, has said we're looking potentially at 3 million votes for president on November 3, which is up from 2.7 in 2016, and 1/3 or more of those would be cast absentee. So at yesterday's briefing, Megan Wolf was asked about the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals ruling. Let's hear from her.
I mean, whether this is appealed or not, what kind of ramifications is this going to have on voters, the back and forth so close to Election Day?
Well, we've been really careful about that, right? So we've been making sure to not, sort of solidify any of those changes right now, because we still have to figure out exactly what is going to happen upon appeal, and we still need to analyze the decision that came in today as well. So, in the interest of certainly not confusing voters, I don't think it's worth going down that path too much, especially at this point before we've had a chance to look at that decision. But we will. We keep looking ahead at some of those implications and what we'll need to do, charting the path for how we're going to communicate what the ultimate decision is to both voters, training our local election officials and our clerks on what they'll need to consider in those events. So we continue to be very aware of all of that and make sure that we are postured to be able to implement that, to train on that as soon as possible, as soon as we have some finality in those decisions.
So, JR, I just want to come back to this for a little bit. As you alluded to, but let's say another player, the U.S. Supreme Court, could be heard from here. But in its ruling, the Seventh Circuit cited an earlier U.S. Supreme Court ruling warning about major changes to election laws or procedures this close to election. But it's still possible that we haven't received the last word on this, correct?
Absolutely. And a footnote to all this is, remember, the Seventh Circuit had originally ruled that lawmakers don't have standing to challenge the decision making the changes.
Right.
Republicans took a gamble and said, hey, we think you got it wrong. We want you to ask the state Supreme Court for clarification. The gamble paid off. The court asked the state Supreme Court, okay, provide some clarity, because the federal court relied on that ruling from the summer and make its decision. State Supreme Court came back on this week and said, yes, lawmakers have standing to defend statutes when they're challenged to count their constitutionality. There's another win for Republicans this week when it comes to courts and what they can do in terms of state statutes being challenged.
Yeah, that's perfect segue. Let's just dwell on that. So the question before the state Supreme Court: do legislators have standing to defend laws? And if, parenthetically, those laws don't want to be defended by the governor and the attorney general, the state's top legal officer, in a 4-3 ruling, said yes, legislators have standing. Reading just a little bit from the majority opinion from Justice Brian Hagedorn, state law unmistakably grants the legislature an interest in defending the validity of state law when challenged in court. So this ruling, state Supreme Court then went back to the Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Republicans won. That's a takeaway, right, JR?
Absolutely. And now, again, it's up to whether the groups, including some who are lean Democratic, want to challenge this decision, the U.S. Supreme Court, and take their shot there, and that remains to be seen.
Okay. Now let's turn to the Marquette poll. First of all, because the election is less than a month away, only weeks away, let's talk about the newest numbers, although they changed only slightly. 700 registered voters were asked, who are you inclined to vote for? The October results: Biden 46, Trump 41, Joe Jorgensen, a Libertarian, 4. How does that change from September? September, Mr. Biden 47, Mr. Trump 43, Joe Jorgensen again 4%. Anything significant, JR? Because you quoted Mr. Goldstein, the former UW, now the West Coast guru, as saying it's significant that Mr. Biden has been able to maintain his lead in Wisconsin for a number of months, right?
Things have not changed, and it's been interesting because of the number of things that have happened in Wisconsin and nationally over the last 6 months, that it's been fairly static since May. Now, there are a couple of warning signs to the president, however. Number one, he's at 41% a month out from the election as an incumbent. That is not a good place to be. Now, back up 4 years, early October poll from Marquette, Clinton 46, Trump 42. So there is still a path for the president to win Wisconsin. The change, though, from 4 years ago is, one, he's the incumbent now. Clinton was in some ways viewed as the incumbent because she was part of the establishment. Trump now has a record. He is the incumbent. There's a rule of thumb in politics that undecideds break against the incumbent, usually 2-1, a rough rule of thumb. This is a problem area for the president to be in. Number two, Hillary Clinton was as disliked, if not more disliked, than Donald Trump 4 years ago. For the first time in the Marquette poll this month, we saw Joe Biden's numbers in the positive territory. Now, they were great. It's like +3, I think it was. But still, he's not the same level of unlikability that Hillary Clinton was. So the president is in a difficult position. Then add in that, what we've looked at WisPolitics.com, The president is getting outspent on TV, radio, cable, and digital in Wisconsin badly, and that advantage is going to continue through November election. That's unheard of for an incumbent president in a swing state. He's even like paring back his media buys right now in Wisconsin, which is not a good sign.
Okay.
And two, the race remains a referendum on Trump. He has failed so far to make it a debate or a choice between him and Joe Biden. As long as a referendum on Trump, it's not a great place for him to be.
Okay. A couple other elements in the MU poll I want to land on. First of all, U.S. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said the Senate's going to do one thing, and that's push to confirm Judge Amy Coney Barrett, for the Supreme Court. So Wisconsin, the MU poll asked, should Judge Amy Coney Barrett be confirmed before or after the election? 44% said before, 51% said after. The margin of error on this was, I think, 4.6%. I just find this intriguing. Any quick PSs on this, JR?
No, the only thing they can stop the U.S. Senate from voting on her nomination is going to be before the election is COVID-19, it looks like.
Yeah.
Unless that throws a wrench in the Senate's plans, they are going full tilt ahead to getting that done either before the election or shortly thereafter.
And just a PS, Wisconsin U.S. Senator Ron Johnson said, yes, I've tested positive, but I'm going to vote for, I'm going to be in that Senate chamber voting for Amy Coney Barrett if I have to wear go ahead, JR.
Moon suit.
Okay, just a PS. I also found it very interesting because we will get to the St. Croix judge pondering the mask order later on in the show. But let's get ahead of that by looking at the poll questions. Because of the pandemic, should face masks be required in public? The latest poll released this week, 72% yes, 26% no, and I just want to point out that's a slight 3 percentage point uptick in the numbers supporting masks in public and a 3 percentage point decrease in the number from the previous month, September. Any PS on that, JR?
No, it's why Republicans are so hesitant to come in and take a vote on this, because they know they're losing in right now in public sentiment.
Right, and that point is even more dramatically illustrated by a follow-up question by Mr. Franklin of the pollster. Support for face masks in public places by party identification. I just find this so interesting. Republicans, 47-49%, which is a tie when you consider that margin error of 4%. Independents, 2-1 support, and Democrats, 98-1. I had to go back to poll 3 times to double check that figure, 98-1. So this is a big reason why Republicans like Speaker Voss are attacking it through the rulemaking process and not coming back to vote to overturn the governor's mask edict. Right, JR?
Absolutely. Look, if you think about it too, their support for the mask mandate across the regions of Wisconsin, and the fight of the assembly right now is in the suburbs over how it's going to come out. And that's a problem for Republicans to have this issue in the front burner. And they realize that if they have some of the suburban members vote on this because some want to vote to overturn it, it would come back to bite them with voters on election day.
Yeah, and if you go into the weeds on this poll like JR and I do, you'll find the highest support, 87% in the city of Milwaukee, and the drop-off, 66% in the rest of Milwaukee County, the suburbs that JR just alluded to. Okay, final topic. You and I, JR, watched as St. Croix Judge Waterman, he listened to both sides. Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty, he held a hearing, St. Croix Court, on Monday on a request for an injunction overturning the governor's extension of the mask order through November. Now, I just want to point out, he said at the onset, and again when he was questioning both lawyers, look, state law says the relief here lies with the legislature. The legislature can go along with the extension of the mask edict, or it can overturn it and rescind it. He asked very pointedly, why should the judiciary, me, get involved? He also promised a very quick opinion that JR and all the reporters in the Capitol have been waiting for now 5 days. JR, you're on your computer, no sign of a ruling?
And as of the last time I refreshed the page, again, it's interesting that Republicans don't want to take this vote. They want the courts to kind of bail them out.
Yeah.
And in a filing from Republican lawmakers, the argument was that the courts need to do this, not them. That even though it's their power, that they need the courts because the governor could just keep issuing new orders and get into a cat and mouse game of like, overturn it, new order, overturn it, new order. Now, we'll see if the judge is persuaded by that. But the fact that it's taken until Friday, I'm kind of curious what the holdup has been in issuing decision in this case when they'd asked for temporary restraining order to prevent injunction immediately or prevent enforcement right away.
And Judge Waterman said the obvious. We all know this will be repealed to the Court of Appeals, and they may certify it and ask the Supreme Court to take it directly. Okay, JR, you have 2 minutes, and I'm counting, or 40 seconds each for stock picks. Go.
Rising Beth Myers, if you go back to the outset of the session, she was a top target for Republicans because Donald Trump won her district, I think, by like 3 percentage points in 2016. We've been checking a firm that we subscribe to on media buys. She's reserved $428,000 on TV in her Wisconsin district between now and Election Day. Actually, last few weeks in Election Day. Now, I know we're kind of getting older, Steve, you more than me, but I remember when a congressional campaign spending $420,000 on TV was considered impressive. This is an assembly race in which her opponent has raised $10,000 at the end of August. Now, it seems to be suggesting that they're not taking any chances. Remember, this whole effort is about not letting Republicans get to the magic number of 2/3 in both houses to override the governor's vetoes, not taking any chances on the key seats. It might be overkill because the fights in the suburbs and their chances to pick up seats for Democrats, but still, the fact she's got that advantage is a huge plus for her up in the Wisconsin district.
Okay, I've got some observations, but we got to move on. Mixed.
The Marquette poll, we suspected at the last poll when his numbers dropped a little bit, that's because of Kenosha. This poll confirms it. He was upside down on handling Kenosha post-violent protest. 40% approved, 44% disapproved. Still in great territory overall. I mean, think about it. Scott Walker and Jim Doyle didn't enjoy being in the mid-50s in their approval ratings very much in their terms of office. That said, I'm going to go back to earth. And now the mask mandate is popular, but we have this new order about limiting indoor gatherings. Is that a tipping point for people? Is that going to be a bridge too far? I'm not sure about that. And oh, by the way, the governor's done a great job, his administration has done a great job maneuvering the things with the COVID-19. He still has the DWD problem. Unemployment is still a mess over there. There's still a significant backlog that's still hanging out over his head.
Except they say the backlog is down to 8%. Oops, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Falling.
Percent. About 6 months in.
Falling.
Bars and restaurants. So with that new order limiting indoor gatherings, if you look, the governor just hours before that came out, put out a release about $100 million in aid for businesses impacted by COVID-19. There's money there for movie theaters, money there for music venues. There wasn't an obvious pot of money for bars and restaurants. Now, there are, I'm told, some avenues to apply for money from the We're All in This Together grants from WEDC. The issue is that it is apparent that this order is geared toward places where people gather for entertainment, right? We've got an issue with people not social distancing. They're trying to get people apart for a month. The challenge is that a lot of bars and restaurants were struggling already because the economy has slowed down. People have as much take-home income. There are local restrictions on, how many people you have in your business. Now you're going to 25% for a month, which the governor says is 2 incubation periods. True. But that's a month right as we're hitting, we can't really have outdoor drink. Well, if you're hardy, you can still drink outdoors in Wisconsin in October. If it gets a little chilly, a couple of weeks, it's going to be an extra impact for these bars and restaurants. And some are already closing doors saying the next month is a no-go for us. We just can't make it work.
Okay. And I just want to say that in this campaign season of COVID, candidates across Wisconsin have had to campaign in new ways. They were relying on Zoom for meet the candidates. They're relying on Zoom for fundraisers. And that means that the 210 candidate interviews that WisconsinEye has conducted so far, and I'll be doing a few more next week, are more important than ever for candidates to introduce themselves and their views. So all those interviews are in wisconsineye.org. We're at 210 and counting. We'll be doing more by the end of next week. More than ever this year with COVID, those interviews are important. Now, let's look ahead quickly to next week. JR, on Thursday, DOA has, the Department of Administration has to balance the books, consider what was actually spent in spent in expenditures, and reconcile the taxes that came in. So we're going to have some major news on the July 1 surplus next week, don't you think?
Yeah, it doesn't tell us about the real problem or issue. Challenge is going to be this fiscal year and the next biennium. That's where the issue is going to be.
Okay. But it's a major step forward in terms of assessing the state's fiscal picture. I'm Steve Walders.
And I'm J.R. Ross.
That's Rewind for October 9.
Rewind, your week in review, is sponsored by the Wisconsin Realtors Association, bringing Wisconsin communities to life with great homes, businesses, and neighborhoods. The Wisconsin Realtors Association, the voice of real estate.